Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Marcus Whitfield said 48 minutes before everything changed. Cedar Creek Medical smells like industrial antiseptic and burnt coffee, a combination that never quite fades, no matter how many times the cleaning crew cycles through with their industrial buffers. Fluorescent lights hum overhead in that specific pitch that makes your teeth ache if you listen too long. Katie Morrison knows this pitch. She's heard it in hospitals across 5 continents. She wipes down bedside tables in the pediatric wing, 3 months into a nursing job that looks ordinary, scrubs with a coffee stain near the collar, dark hair in a practical bun, hand steady as she checks vitals on the monitors. She moves through her shifts invisible, competent, unremarkable. Another nurse. The kind nobody remembers. But her locker contains a tarnished military challenge coin she studies during breaks, worn smooth by a decade of hands that no longer belong to her official life. And when she walks, there's the faintest limp in her left leg, shrapnel damage from Tikrit, the kind of scar that tells a story if anyone bothered to ask. The locker sits in the staff room on the 3rd floor, combination 14-27-09, wedged between a resident's coat rack and a bulletin board advertising yoga classes. Katie opens it twice daily. The coin sits on the top shelf, behind her spare ID badge, catching the fluorescent light like a secret. She doesn't touch it often. Just looks. Reminds herself why she's here, invisible in Atlanta instead of visible anywhere else. Room 314 is down the hallway. Katie has passed it 17 times today. 8-year-old Emma Hartley lies in that room, skeletal thin under a quilted hospital blanket, refusing every meal for 14 days straight. 20 different doctors have examined her across 4 hospitals. 20. They've ordered labs, imaging, psychiatric consults. They've measured her blood work and her weight loss and her refusal to swallow. And none of them have found what's actually wrong with her. The charts say a failure to thrive. The charts say a likely eating disorder. The charts whisper the word anorexia in tones that sound like accusation. But Katie has been looking at the wrong thing. She's not looking at Emma's weight loss. She's not looking at the girl's hollow eyes or the way she turns her head away from every tray. She's looking at the challenge coin the girl clutches in her small fist, the same one Katie carries in her locker, worn and tarnished and impossible to forget. Emma presses it repeatedly against her throat. A tic, the psychiatrists called it. A manifestation of anxiety, they said. A soothing behavior, nothing more. Katie has watched her do this 43 times today. Lieutenant Commander James Hartley sits vigil in the chair beside Emma's bed, the kind of vigil that only a military parent understands, all night watching, the inability to sleep, the permanent crease between his eyebrows that comes from 18 months of deployment and 6 weeks of watching your child waste away. He's exhausted. His uniform is crisp, but his face is hollow with the same thing Emma has. He has a tattoo on his right forearm. K. A. Morrison. Black ink, professional work, the kind of tattoo that means something. Katie has seen that forearm before. She'd wrapped a bandage around it once, in a Humvee outside Tikrit, while rounds came in from 3 directions and Hartley kept screaming coordinates into a radio with blood running down his jaw. She'd carried him through a 4-hour firefight with 2 other SEALs, all of them bleeding, all of them moving because moving was the alternative to dying. Hartley doesn't know her. She's been invisible for 3 months, and she'll stay invisible. That's the job. That's always been the job. But when she entered room 314 an hour ago to check Emma's 4, Hartley looked straight through her like she was part of the furniture. His eyes were looking for someone in a different uniform. Someone with a different face. Someone who wasn't wearing scrubs and had coffee stains and moved like a nurse instead of like a soldier. The thing he didn't see was that she was all 3 at once. Dr. Marcus Whitfield arrived for evening rounds at 5:48 p.m., and the entire wing changed temperature. That's what presence does when it's backed by institutional power. He moved down the hallway like a man who'd never questioned his right to occupy space, silver hair immaculate, white coat unbuttoned in that way that signals complete confidence. His stethoscope hung around his neck like a medal. Cedar Creek's chief of pediatrics. The man whose reputation was built on the hospital's flawless public image, on never admitting uncertainty, on solving everything or making sure nobody found out he hadn't. He spent for minutes with Emma Hartley. Clearly psychological, Katie heard him tell Hartley through the cracked door. His voice came across like a diagnosis, like a verdict. Like a man who'd decided the answer before he ever asked the question. The girl is refusing to eat because she's anxious about something. Psychiatric evaluation would be the next appropriate step. We could have someone from mental health up here by tomorrow morning. Hartley had nodded. Desperate men nod at anything that sounds like hope. Whitfield had already turned away before Katie even saw him enter the nurse's station, where she was updating Emma's chart. The other 3 nurses were there: Sandra, who'd been at Cedar Creek for 8 years, Marcus, the day shift resident, and Tommy, who was eating something from a container that smelled like cilantro and hope. They all straightened a little. That's what happened when Whitfield arrived. The air pressure changed. The fluorescent light seemed to buzz louder. So, Whitfield said, and his voice carried that specific tone of someone about to make a pronouncement. We have a new nurse in pediatrics. Katie didn't look up. She kept her pen moving across Emma's chart. Steady hand. Practiced invisibility. I've noticed you asking questions about patients, Whitfield continued, and now his attention was await. About their cases. Their treatment protocols. Their care plans. Just trying to learn, Katie said. Her voice came out soft, deferential, the way she'd learned to pitch it. Apologetic. Small. I want to understand the pediatric cases better. That's admirable, Whitfield said, and the smile that crossed his face was the smile of a man about to establish dominance. I'll make you a bet. You're asking too many questions about patients who aren't your responsibility. In 1 week, you'll realize this job isn't for you. You'll quit. And we'll never have this conversation again. Sandra's intake of breath was audible. Marcus, the resident, suddenly found his hands very interesting. Tommy kept chewing. I'm not betting against myself, Katie said quietly. She didn't look at Whitfield. Just kept writing. Consider it a sure thing, Whitfield said. He smiled at the room like he'd just delivered a performance. 1 week. He walked away, and the fluorescent light seemed to stop humming for exactly 1 second. The thing about being trained by the Navy SEALs is that you learn how to compartmentalize. You learn that anger is information, not emotion. You learn that your face can be a mask even when something inside you wants to burn. Katie had been trained in survival swimming, in urban combat, in hostage negotiation, and in 17 different ways to disable a person twice her size. But the most important thing they'd taught her was how to sit still and be invisible while someone tried to provoke her. Her jaw had clenched once, barely perceptible. That was all. The next day, at 12:15 p.m., Katie was in the hospital cafeteria collecting the lunch she'd promised herself she'd eat. A turkey sandwich, potato chips, bottled water, a granola bar. Nothing fancy. The kind of lunch that took 5 minutes to assemble and wouldn't make her regret it. The tray was plastic, light blue, the kind of institutional tray that had probably been used in 1,000 hospital cafeterias across America. Dr. Whitfield was standing 2 people back in line. Katie didn't notice him until she was turning away from the checkout counter, tray balanced on her right hand, the way nurses learn to do, efficient, practiced, the way you carried things when you needed both hands free for emergencies. She was reviewing the day in her head. Emma had refused breakfast again. She'd clutched that challenge coin against her throat 3 times before 9 a.m. The imaging films from her initial X-ray showed a shadow near the esophagus that made Katie's instinct scream, but her job wasn't to diagnose. Her job was to be invisible and watch. Whitfield moved past her like he'd calculated the exact angle needed. His shoulder connected with hers. Not violent. Just forceful. Just hard enough. The tray went airborne. The turkey sandwich cartwheeled. The chips scattered across the linoleum like confetti. The bottled water exploded on impact, and papers, because Katie had been holding her notebook on top of the tray, chart notes she'd been reviewing, scattered across the cafeteria floor like they'd been fired from a cannon. The granola bar bounced twice and slid under a table. The room did that thing where everyone stops. Forks pause. Conversations mid-sentence. A moment of collective witnessing. Whitfield turned around. He looked down at the destroyed lunch, the scattered papers, the water spreading in a slow arc across the floor. And then he looked at Katie with a smile that was meant to break something. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. His voice was soft. Almost kind. That was the worst part. That was the thing designed to humiliate, the tone you use for someone who's beneath you, who needs instruction on how to clean up their own mess, who needs to be reminded of their place. The cafeteria had about 32 people in it. Katie had counted. She could see all of them in her peripheral vision. She could see Sandra from pediatrics pretending to read her phone. She could see 2 residents openly staring. She could see Tommy shaking his head very slightly. She could see the maintenance worker by the trash cans who'd witnessed the whole thing, and she could see the calculation in his eyes, whether this was worth reporting, whether Whitfield was the kind of man to make someone's life difficult if they defended the nurse. Katie knelt down. Her knees bent smoothly, 3 decades of muscle memory, and she began picking up papers. The chart notes for 3 different patients. Her own handwriting. Whitfield's shadow fell across her as she worked. He didn't move away. He stood there, watching, letting the moment extend. She gathered the papers without hurrying. Systematic. The way you clean up a scene. The way you approach something that needs doing and you simply do it. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She picked up the turkey sandwich, now contaminated with flour and water, and placed it on the destroyed tray. She collected every single chip. She grabbed the granola bar from under the table. She stood up, still holding the tray, still holding the papers. "My apologies, doctor," she said softly. Not looking at him. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "That's the trouble with people who ask too many questions," Whitfield said. He was still smiling. They stopped paying attention to what's right in front of them. He walked away. The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone's fork clinked against a plate. The cafeteria went back to being a cafeteria. Katie stood there for 3 seconds. Her jaw had clenched again, but only once. Her hands were steady. The mask was still in place. And somewhere inside, in that compartment where soldiers keep the things that would destroy them if they thought about them too long, she made a note. Whitfield wasn't just testing her. He was establishing dominance. He was making sure the room saw that he could break things and that she would pick them up. He was creating a pattern. What he didn't know was that Katie Morrison had been watching patterns her entire career. She recognized them. She understood them. And she knew exactly what stage of escalation she was watching. That night, at 11:43 p.m., Katie sat in her car in the Cedar Creek parking garage. The engine was off. The city of Atlanta sprawled beyond the concrete structure, lights on in 1,000 windows, people sleeping, people waking, people unaware that their hospital's chief of pediatrics had just demonstrated that he saw himself as untouchable. She pulled out her phone. The X-ray films were still loaded in her secure medical app. She zoomed in on Emma's initial chest and abdominal imaging from 3 weeks ago, before the girl had refused to eat, before 20 doctors had decided she was anxious or anorexic or psychologically damaged. There. The shadow near the esophagus. Round. Approximately the size of. Katie pulled the challenge coin from her pocket. She held it up to the phone's light. Compared the diameter to the shadow on the screen. The match was perfect. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that when she looked up through the parking garage's open wall, she could see directly into room 314 on the 3rd floor. And in that room, under the fluorescent lights, she could see James Hartley sitting vigil beside his daughter's bed. The same man she'd carried through a firefight in Tikrit. The same man who'd survived because she didn't let him stop moving. The same man whose forearm bore her name in permanent ink. He was holding his daughter's hand, and he had no idea who was parking below him, or why Katie Morrison was sitting in the dark with a decade-old coin in her hand, staring at the girl who was slowly starving to death. The next morning, Katie approached the nurse's station with Emma's file in hand, the pages already organized, measurements already calculated. Dr. Whitfield stood reviewing a chart, his pressed white coat unmarked by a single drop of blood or coffee or the reality of what happened on hospital floors. She'd learned his schedule across 3 months. He always arrived at 7:41 a.m., coffee from the private administrator's cafe, always checked the pediatric census before rounds. Dr. Whitfield, Katie said, voice steady and measured. I'd like to discuss Emma Hartley's imaging. He looked up slowly, the kind of look a man gives when interrupted by someone he's already calculated the worth of. Yes? The initial x-rays from her admission, Katie continued, keeping her tone professional and deferential. The shadow in her esophagus. The dimensions are 23 millimeters. I was reviewing her chart, and I noticed. How long have you been a nurse, sweetheart? Whitfield asked, setting down his pen with deliberate slowness. His voice carried across the entire station, crisp as a scalpel. 3 months here? 4. 3 months, Katie said quietly. 3 months, he repeated, turning slightly so 2 other physicians could hear clearly. I've been a physician for 23 years. I've attended the Pediatric Symposium in Chicago 3 times. I've personally reviewed Emma Hartley's case alongside colleagues from 4 different hospitals. 20 specialists, Katie. 20. He pronounced her name like it tasted of something bitter. Do you really believe you've identified something that eluded all of them? A nurse at the adjacent computer screen suddenly became very focused on her work. Katie's hands remained perfectly still on the file folder. The paper didn't tremble. Neither did her voice. I'm suggesting we consider an alternative perspective. The coin dimensions that Emma carries, the challenge coin her father gave her, match the imaging shadow exactly. Whitfield's expression shifted, a smile spreading across his face that looked like a wolf showing teeth. A challenge coin, he repeated, his voice rising just slightly. You're building a diagnosis based on a child's anxiety toy. He turned to face the gathered staff directly, and his voice became almost theatrical. I'll make a bet right now. Our new nurse here quits within a week. Any takers? 2 doctors smiled. One actually laughed, a short, sharp sound like a door slamming. Katie's jaw clenched once, a barely perceptible tightening of muscles, but her face remained blank. A mask. A fortress. I'd like to formally request an endoscopy to rule out foreign body obstruction, she said, each word clipped and precise. Request denied, Whitfield said, already turning back to his charts. And Katie? Stop wasting my time with amateur diagnoses. Stick to your scope of practice. Empty bedpans. Take vitals. Leave medicine to the doctors. His eyes flicked toward her once more, and there was something in them, recognition of her composure, which seemed to irritate him more than anger would have. Now get back to work. That afternoon, Katie sat alone in the hospital cafeteria reviewing Emma's charts during her lunch break. She'd spread the papers across her plastic tray, imaging films, lab results, the timeline of her refusals to eat. Her sandwich sat untouched beside the papers, the coffee growing cold. She was tracing the measurements again, comparing them, when she felt him before she saw him. Whitfield paused at her table, his expensive shoes polished to a shine that reflected the fluorescent lights above them. He was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then he deliberately knocked the entire tray to the floor. The sound was catastrophic. The coffee cup shattered across the tile, spraying brown liquid in a corona pattern. Papers scattered like leaves. The sandwich hit the ground butter side down. Several doctors at surrounding tables went still. Pick that up, sweetheart, Whitfield said, his voice carrying across the cafeteria with perfect clarity. That's what nurses do. Pick up messes. He smiled, a practice thing that never reached his eyes, and walked away. Katie's jaw clenched once. Hard. Her hands made fists. For 3 full seconds she remained kneeling on the cafeteria floor, the smell of spilled coffee acrid in her nostrils, surrounded by scattered papers and broken ceramic. But she didn't shake. She didn't speak. She simply knelt, gathered the pieces with steady hands, and collected every page before standing and disposing of the debris. Her face was completely blank. A trained mask. Muscle memory from years of taking hits and standing still. In the bathroom afterward, alone, Katie gripped the sink edge so hard her knuckles went white. The metal was cold against her palms, and she stared at her reflection for 30 seconds without moving. The woman staring back was someone she barely recognized anymore, the Master Chief Petty Officer who'd carried 3 wounded SEALs through a 4-hour firefight in Tikrit was compressed into the body of someone who could be knocked down in a cafeteria and say nothing. Her reflection didn't blink. Neither did she. Then she released the sink, splashed water on her face, and returned to her shift. No one would have known anything had happened. But that wasn't the worst part. Over the next 72 hours, Dr. Whitfield began building his case with the precision of a man who'd learned exactly how to destroy someone quietly. He called her supposed previous hospital in Chicago, the cover identity that Katie's handlers had constructed 3 years ago but never fully stress-tested. "I'm just doing standard reference verification," he told the voice on the other end, a voice that wasn't actually the hospital, because Katie's cover was already beginning to crack like ice in spring. He mentioned to the hospital administrator that concerns have been raised about this nurse's credentials. Her employment history doesn't quite add up. "I'm sure it's nothing, but we should probably have someone look into it." He made calls to 2 board members who'd approved his pediatrics expansion last year, physicians who owed him favors, suggesting that Katie had been making concerning statements about standard treatment protocols and questioning my medical judgment in front of junior staff. He called the hospital's lead investor, a man who valued reputation above everything else, and whispered about potential liability exposure from a nurse who might be operating outside her scope of practice. He was building a narrative. Layer by layer. The competent destruction of someone who'd challenged him. On Emma's 14th day of refusing food, her weight had dropped to 62 pounds. Her small frame looked hollow in the hospital bed, her 7-year-old face aged by starvation. Katie stood outside the girls' room and watched through the window as Lieutenant Commander James Hartley held his daughter's hand, whispering promises he couldn't keep, about getting better, about going home, about all the ice cream she could eat once she recovered. His forearm bore the tattoo of her name in permanent ink, a memorial to someone who'd disappeared from his life years ago. Emma still clutched the challenge coin. She pressed it against her throat repeatedly, a gesture, a tick, a rhythm that everyone had dismissed as anxiety. The school psychologist had noted it. The first pediatrician had noted it. The neurologist had dismissed it as a stress response. 20 doctors had seen a desperate child displaying psychological distress. Katie saw something different. She'd spent enough time in field medicine to understand what the body tells you when the mouth stays silent. Emma's throat tick wasn't random. It was repetitive. Targeted. She was pressing the coin against the exact same spot every time, lower esophagus, right lateral position, applying pressure with the precision of someone whose nervous system was sending alarms. Katie pulled out the initial X-rays from the admission file. The shadow in Emma's esophageal region. She measured it carefully against a ruler. 23 millimeters. Then she measured the challenge coin that Emma's father had given her before he deployed to Tikrit, before everything changed. 23 millimeters exactly. The coin was military issue, standard diameter, slightly tarnished from years in someone's pocket. The foreign object lodged in Emma's esophagus was the exact size and shape of the coin the girl pressed against her throat 14 times a day. 20 doctors had missed it. Katie approached Whitfield outside Emma's room that afternoon with the measurements, the comparison laid out clearly. The challenge coin dimensions match the imaging shadow exactly, she said quietly. An endoscopy would confirm foreign body obstruction. If that coin entered her esophagus. "You're still on this?" Whitfield's voice dropped to something colder than anger. I've already documented your inappropriate persistence in questioning physician decisions. It's becoming a pattern, Katie. A concerning pattern. He leaned closer, and his voice became something else entirely, a threat delivered in hospital quiet. You want to know what I think? I think you're hiding something. Your references are shaky. Your credentials don't quite line up. So here's my suggestion: stop making waves, stop questioning my judgment in front of staff, or I'll dig deeper into exactly who you are. And I have resources you can't imagine. Katie's face betrayed nothing. But inside, her entire body was calculating risk the way it had been trained to calculate risk for 2 decades. 6 months of undercover work. A suspected medical fraud ring operating out of Cedar Creek Medical's billing department. Thousands of fraudulent claims filed under fake procedures, kickbacks funneled to Whitfield through consulting fees. She was supposed to observe, document, build the case for federal prosecution. But Emma was dying. And Whitfield knew she'd noticed something he couldn't allow her to report. That evening, Whitfield made calls. To 2 board members who'd approved his expansion. To the hospital's lead investor. To an outside investigator who specialized in credential verification. He was building his endgame, moving from public humiliation to strategic destruction. His voice on the phone was smooth as silk, concerned, collaborative, the voice of a man genuinely worried about hospital liability. By midnight, the wheels were in motion. Katie sat in her car in the parking garage, engine dead, unable to start it. The concrete ceiling above her was stained with decades of oil and exhaust. The air smelled like rubber and something chemical she couldn't name. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, her hand slack in her lap, and realized the impossible calculation she was facing. Stay silent, follow protocol, maintain her cover. Emma dies slowly, and the mission continues. Act, save the girl, blow 6 months of undercover work. The fraud ring walks free. Whitfield keeps his job, his reputation, his power. Katie gets fired, arrested possibly, her cover shattered across a background check that would collapse like wet tissue. She had no idea that everything was about to change. Day 14 arrived with the kind of quiet that made Katie's chest tight. Emma Hartley weighed 62 pounds now, a number that lived in Katie's head alongside every other vital statistic she'd memorized. The girl's collarbones jutted like tent stakes beneath her hospital gown. Her wrists had become narrow as a bird's, skin translucent enough to see the blue tributaries beneath. 14 days of refusing food. 14 days of her father watching her disappear 1 meal at a time, and everyone, the nutritionists, the psychiatrists, the social workers, had concluded that Emma was simply choosing not to eat. Choosing not to live. That was the narrative Dr. Whitfield had stitched into her chart, and no one questioned the architect. Katie stood outside Emma's room at 2:48 a.m., watching through the small window in the door. Lieutenant Commander James Hartley sat in a vinyl chair beside his daughter's bed, his right forearm resting on the mattress, and even from this distance, Katie could see it clearly. The tattoo. K. A. Morrison. Black ink that had been applied in a medic tent outside Fallujah 17 years ago by a corpsman with shaking hands while mortar rounds landed 200 meters away. She'd carried Hartley through 400 yards of open fire in Tikrit, both his legs bleeding out, his weight across her shoulders like a living monument to the cost of staying in the fight. He'd asked for her name, and when she told him, he'd said, "When I make it home, I'm getting it put on me. So I never forget." And he hadn't. But he was looking straight through her now, seeing only another anonymous nurse in navy scrubs, another face in the procession of medical staff that had failed his daughter. Emma clutched the challenge coin, his challenge coin, the one from his first deployment, and pressed it repeatedly against her throat. The motion had become habitual. A tic everyone attributed to anxiety. Press. Release. Press. Release. Like a child soothing herself with a familiar weight. Katie had reviewed the imaging 17 times. The coin's diameter was exactly 1.7 inches. The shadow in Emma's esophagus on the initial X-ray was consistent with a foreign body of that precise dimension, positioned at the level of the lower esophageal sphincter. The coin wasn't moving. It was lodged. And as Emma swallowed, as she tried desperately to eat because her father kept pleading with her to try just a bite, the coin would shift minutely with each contraction, scraping the mucosal lining, causing pain so acute that her body had learned the only survival response was to refuse all food entirely. A child's brilliant immune system recognizing danger and shutting down the mechanism that activated it. Whitfield had dismissed it. Whitfield, who made $487,000 per year and sat on the boards of 3 charities and whose reputation depended entirely on Cedar Creek Medical's pediatric metrics remaining flawless. A diagnosis of foreign body obstruction meant admitting that not one of the 20 doctors Emma had seen across for different hospitals had bothered to look at a simple X-ray with clear eyes. It meant endoscopy, surgery, institutional liability. It meant acknowledging a failure so profound that it would ripple through the entire hospital system like a crack in a dam. It was easier to medicate Emma with sertraline. Easier to call her depressed. Katie moved away from the window and retreated to the nurse's station, where the fluorescent lights cast everything in sickly ultraviolet. She pulled up Emma's latest vitals on the computer screen. Heart rate 118. Respiratory rate 24. Oxygen saturation 94%. Trending the wrong direction. Her small body was beginning to sense what Emma's conscious mind didn't understand yet, that she was slowly suffocating, that the thing she was clinging to for comfort was becoming the thing that would kill her. The night stretched like pulled taffy. Katie reviewed the chart again, making notes in handwriting so precise it could have been typed. She calculated timing. She thought about protocols and consequences. She thought about the phone call she'd made to Cedar Creek Medical's supposed nursing supervisor in Chicago 3 weeks ago to verify her cover employment, and how Whitfield's investigator had called that office 6 times now, asking increasingly specific questions about dates and shifts and competencies. Cover stories were like houses built on sand. The investigation hadn't collapsed yet, but the tide was coming in. At 6:14 a.m., Dr. Whitfield arrived in the pediatric wing wearing a cashmere coat that probably cost more than Katie made in a month. He found her at the nurse's station reviewing Emma's chart, again. His smile was conversational. Practiced. "I've been speaking with the board," he said, pulling up a chair with the casual confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. "They're concerned about a nurse who consistently questions physician authority. Who makes wild diagnostic claims without any basis in established medicine. Whose employment history has some troubling gaps when we dig into it." He leaned back, watching her face. "There's going to be a formal review tomorrow morning. 11 o'clock. I'd suggest you have your documentation in order." Katie didn't look up from the chart. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Pure, physical restraint. The effort it took to keep her hand steady, keep her voice level, keep 17 years of combat training from spilling out across this hospital floor. "I'll be here tomorrow," she said quietly. "Of course you will," Whitfield said. He stood, buttoning his coat. Although, resigning tonight would save everyone considerable embarrassment. "Your choice, of course." The moment he left, Katie called her undercover liaison at the FBI field office in Washington, D.C. The phone rang 3 times before Special Agent Darius Chen answered. "Katie," he said, "no greeting, all business. His investigator just reached out to your supposed nursing school at Northwestern. Asked about your graduation year, your maiden name, whether you'd ever been disciplined." The cover's beginning to unravel. Katie's eyes closed. 14 years she'd been doing this kind of work. 14 years of living in the spaces between identities, of being no one for long enough to become something dangerous. How much time before it completely collapses? 24 to 36 hours. Maybe less if he pushes. "You need to extract now, tonight. Come in from the cold. We'll set up a new identity, new hospital." "No." Katie opened her eyes and looked toward the pediatric wing. Toward the room where Emma Hartley was slowly suffocating. Toward Lieutenant Commander James Hartley, who was sitting there in that vinyl chair holding his daughter's hand, not knowing that the woman 3 rooms over could save her. not knowing who she was. I need until tomorrow night. That's not. One more day, Katie said. Emma Hartley needs one more day. The silence on the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Chen said, "Don't ask me to make that call higher up. Whatever you're planning, make sure it's worth the career you're about to blow up." The call ended. Katie sat in the fluorescent darkness and understood that she had just made the choice that would end her mission. Not the investigation would survive. The FBI would arrest Whitfield eventually, would uncover the fraud network, would bring down whoever was siphoning millions from the hospital's research grants. That would all still happen. But her 6 months of careful undercover work, her identity as Katie Morrison, the timid new nurse with the employment gaps and the quiet certainty, all of it was about to be irrelevant. At 7:33 p.m. that evening, Katie sat on her apartment floor still wearing her scrubs, still smelling like hand sanitizer and institutional soap. She pulled out her personal phone and opened her photos to the one she looked at approximately once per month. Marcus at 17, tall as she was now, standing in her kitchen with his father's jawline and her mother's dark eyes. He was in boarding school in Virginia, 280 miles away from Atlanta, 280 miles away from the explosion that was about to detonate through her life. She typed, "I might need you to come to Atlanta tomorrow. Bring the shadow box." The response came back in 90 seconds. "Already packing." She didn't ask how he'd known. Some things lived in the blood between mothers and sons, some knowledge that required no transmission, no explanation. Marcus had been raised with the understanding that there were emergencies and then there were other kinds of emergencies, the kind where his mother, who had never asked him for anything, suddenly needed him to appear with the medals and the uniform and the evidence of who she actually was. At 11:02 p.m., Emma Hartley's vitals spiked. Katie's pager went off as she lay staring at the ceiling of her apartment. Code alert. Pediatric ICU. Room for 12. She was in her car and moving before her conscious mind caught up, muscle memory taking over, the drive to Cedar Creek Medical taking 9 minutes and 38 seconds from her apartment to the ER bay. The overnight shift was skeleton crew, 3 nurses, 2 residents, and an attending physician who looked like he'd been sleeping in the break room. Emma's oxygen saturation was 88% and dropping. Heart rate 134, sinus tachycardia pushing toward something worse. The girl was gasping, her small chest heaving against the weight of something she couldn't name, something that felt like her body was turning against her. The challenge coin was still clutched in her hand, but her throat had begun to swell around it, the tissue responding to days of chronic irritation with inflammation that was now beginning to compromise her airway. Dr. Whitfield had gone home. Of course he had. His shift ended at 6. Emergencies happened on other people's time. Katie moved to Emma's bedside and found Lieutenant Commander Hartley standing frozen, his face the color of wet concrete. "What's happening?" he demanded. "She was stable an hour ago." "The obstruction shifted," Katie said. Her voice had dropped an octave. The timid nurse persona had evaporated like water on a griddle, and in her place stood someone whose hands knew exactly what to do. "She's losing her airway. We need intubation prep. Now." She turned to the attending. "Get a size 4.0 pediatric endotracheal tube. Suction ready. I need a laryngoscope." "Who authorized?" the attending started. "I'm authorizing it," Katie said. "Get the tube." The attending moved. People always moved when you spoke like you were used to being obeyed, like you'd spent more than a decade commanding small teams through hostile territory. Katie's hands were already on Emma's neck, assessing the thyroid cartilage, calculating angles and pressure. The girl's eyes were wide with terror, but Katie bent down until their faces were level. "Emma, my name is Katie. I need you to listen to me. You're going to be okay. But I need you to stop fighting and just breathe when I tell you to. Can you do that?" Emma nodded, her small hand still gripping the challenge coin like it was the last solid thing in a world that was collapsing. The tube went in clean on the first attempt. Emma's oxygen saturation climbed immediately. 90, 94. 98, her heart rate began to descend from the precipice. The hiss of the ventilator established rhythm, mechanical and steady, giving her lungs the work her conscious will couldn't manage anymore. Katie stepped back, and that was when Whitfield walked in through the ER doors, his phone in his hand, his face already composing itself into the expression of a concerned physician responding to an emergency. He took in the scene, the intubated child, the arterial line Katie had placed, the monitors showing vitals climbing back toward something survivable, and his eyes found Katie. "Who performed the intubation?" he asked. "I did," Katie said. Her voice was steady as a surgical laser. She was losing her airway. 10 minutes from cardiac arrest. Whitfield looked at the attending. Was there a physician order for emergency intubation? The attending couldn't look at Katie. The nurse initiated. That's a protocol violation. Whitfield's voice had become very precise. Very calm. He was already composing the paperwork in his mind, Katie could see it. Already building the narrative. Unauthorized medical procedure. Exceeding scope of practice. Gross insubordination. Evidence tampering when she'd falsified the order paperwork, because he was already certain she had. Dr. Chen in anesthesia can take it from here. Katie, I need you to step away from the patient. Katie looked at Lieutenant Commander Hartley. At Emma, sedated now, her small chest rising and falling in mechanical rhythm. At the challenge coin still gripped in the girl's limp hand. She stepped away from the bedside and didn't watch as Whitfield began documenting the incident that would destroy her career before tomorrow morning's hearing even began. At 2:33 a.m., the alarm started screaming. Not the gentle reminder beeps of a patient stirring. Not the routine warning chirp of a line running dry. This was the full throat wail of a pediatric monitor in complete cardiac distress, the kind of sound that moves through a hospital like electricity through water. Katie heard it from the supply room on the opposite wing and moved before her conscious mind had finished processing. Her feet were already moving toward pediatrics when the overhead crackled, code blue, room for 12. Pediatric. Code blue, room for 12. Emma's room. The hallway was dark except for the corridor lights, that sickly fluorescent glow that made everything look already half dead. Katie hit the double doors running and found the on-call nurse standing frozen at Emma's bedside, hands hovering uselessly above the monitor. The girl's oxygen saturation was dropping like a stone falling through black water, 92, 88, 82, 76, and her heart rate had climbed to 168, a desperate panicked rhythm. Her lips were turning blue. Not the pale blue of a medical diagram. The terrible shade of actual oxygen starvation. Katie was there before the thought completed. "Step back," she said, not a request. The other nurse moved without protest. Emma's eyes were glassy, barely conscious, her small chest heaving with the effort of fighting against something inside her own throat. The tarnished challenge coin. Katie could see it now, the slight bulge in Emma's neck where the coin had shifted position, blocking not just the esophagus but compressing her airway from the outside in. The pressure of it was pressing inward on her trachea like a fist closing. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath and a 10-milliliter syringe," Katie ordered, her voice dropping half an octave. "Now." The nurse was already moving. Katie's hands were steady as surgical steel as she located the anatomical landmarks, the fifth intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact point where needle met ribcage. She'd done this 17 times in the field. Once in a sandstorm outside Fallujah. 3 times in a converted container at FOB Shank. The technique hadn't changed. The stakes had only gotten higher because this was a child and this was Emma and her father was 2 floors up sleeping in a waiting room chair still wearing his service dress uniform. Oxygen sat 71, the nurse whispered. Heart rate 172. Katie didn't answer. She felt the give in the chest wall, that subtle shift of resistance as the needle penetrated the fibrous pericardium and entered the fluid-filled sac around Emma's heart. She pulled the plunger. Blood-tinged fluid emerged into the syringe, the tamponade, the pressure that had been squeezing her daughter's heart like a hand around a tennis ball. As she withdrew the fluid, Emma's oxygen saturation began climbing. 73, 78. 84, her heart rate dropped from its panicked sprint to something almost reasonable. Get transport ready, Katie said. Imaging. Now. Not in 5 minutes. Now. She didn't wait for confirmation. She was already moving Emma's bed, unhooking the monitor cables with hands that had held lives together in places where mortality was the default setting. The imaging tech tried to stop her at the corridor junction, clipboard in hand, speaking about protocols and authorization and chains of command. I don't have authorization for this, he said, blocking the bed. Katie met his eyes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Something in her posture, in the way she held her body, communicated a clarity of purpose that made his resistance dissolve like sugar in water. Do it anyway, she said. He did it anyway. The scanning room was cold, that clinical cold that smelled of disinfectant and ozone from the MRI machine. Katie kept her hand on Emma's shoulder while the tech ran the study, kept the girl's oxygen mask in place, kept speaking in a voice that was absolutely calm even though the inside of her chest was moving at 1,000 miles per hour. 20 doctors had missed this. 20. The best pediatric imaging specialists in Atlanta, specialists with decades of experience, and they'd all looked at the original X-rays and seen nothing but pediatric shadows and normal anatomy. Katie had seen a 23mm metallic object perfectly angled to be invisible to everyone but someone looking specifically for it. Someone who'd held trauma cases in her hands often enough to know exactly what absent diagnosis looked like. The scan took 7 minutes. The results appeared instantly. There. Clear as a bullet hole in snow. The challenge coin lodged in Emma's esophagus at the level of T4, pressing inward on the trachea, the exact compression that had been slowly suffocating the child for 2 weeks. Call emergency extraction, Katie told the tech. Pediatric airway obstruction. Get the on-call attending now. The on-call attending arrived 8 minutes later, saw the imaging, and moved with the speed of someone who understood that children's bodies are smaller than adult bodies and therefore give you less margin for error. The extraction took 43 minutes. Katie watched from the hallway, hands at her sides, breathing through her nose while the surgeon removed the coin using a flexible endoscope and retrieval forceps, guiding it carefully past Emma's vocal cords without damaging the delicate structures that let her speak, sing, laugh. The coin emerged, still tarnished, still bearing the faint markings of whatever unit or operation had stamped it. Emma breathed. Actually breathed. Her oxygen saturation climbed to 98. Her heart rate normalized to something a normal 8-year-old's heart should be doing at 3 in the morning. Lieutenant Commander Hartley arrived in the recovery room while they were monitoring her, and Katie saw him from the hallway, saw him bend over his daughter's sleeping face and cry in a way that men who'd seen combat tried never to cry, the sound of someone who'd been given back something they'd already started to bury in his mind. He held the extracted coin in shaking hands like it was the most precious thing in the world, which, for him, it probably was. Then the sun came up. Then 8 a.m. arrived. Then Dr. Whitfield walked into Cedar Creek Medical and saw the overnight reports. Katie was in the break room, the small one, the one with the broken refrigerator and the coffee maker that had seen better years, when Whitfield found her. She knew exactly what his face would do before he crossed the threshold. She'd seen that particular color progression before in men who'd just realized they'd been catastrophically wrong. The pale, then the red, then the gray of someone watching their carefully constructed narrative collapse in real time. He didn't come alone. Hospital security flanked him, 2 tall men in the uniform polo shirts that meant authority without muscle. The administrator came too, holding a folder that Katie recognized, the background investigation. The one with the fabricated credentials. The cover identity that had begun cracking the moment she'd overridden protocol to save Emma Hartley's life. Miss Morrison, Whitfield began, then caught himself on something. Something in Katie's face, maybe. Something that made him remember she was more than a nurse who defied him. You violated direct physician orders. You performed procedures outside your scope of practice. You commandeered hospital resources without authorization. His voice sounded thin now. Uncertain. Like a man reading from a script he no longer believed in. The administrator stepped forward. "We've completed our background investigation. Your previous employer has no record of a Katie Morrison in their system. Your credentials appear to be fabricated." Katie didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply waited, breathing through her nose, a small muscle working in her jaw, the only visible sign that she was restraining something enormous. "You're terminated, effective immediately," the administrator continued. "Clear your locker. Security will escort you out." Katie nodded once, slow and deliberate. She stood without hurrying, without the trembling that might have made Whitfield feel powerful. She simply stood, and when she did, the room seemed to shift slightly, as if the air pressure had changed. She walked past all three of them toward the locker room with security following, and nobody, not a single nurse, not a single doctor, made eye contact with her. Except for the ones who couldn't look away. Whitfield stood at the nurse's station watching her go, arms crossed, smiling like he'd won something. Like he didn't understand yet that he'd already lost everything. Within 24 hours, Dr. Whitfield made his move. He called the personnel office at Harbor General in Seattle, Katie's supposed previous hospital, the one that existed only in federal databases and false employment records, and spoke to an investigator he'd personally hired. The man's name was Richard Cass, a former hospital administrator turned private auditor with a reputation for finding credential violations. Whitfield paid him $2,800 upfront to validate Katie's background. What he didn't know was that the moment Cass pulled Katie's file, algorithms flagged the inconsistencies. Real hospitals have centuries of digital infrastructure. Fake ones have wrinkles. The timestamps didn't align. The reference numbers didn't cross-check. Harbor General's personnel system showed Katie employed for 6 years, but the hospital's actual staffing records, the ones kept by accounting, by payroll, by the federal CMS database, showed gaps. Cass called Whitfield back within 3 hours. "Your nurse is a ghost," he said. Whitfield's hands went cold. Not because Katie was suspicious. Because whatever she was connected to someone with federal resources. Someone who could create a hospital that didn't exist. He should have stopped there. Instead, he accelerated everything. That afternoon, Whitfield called the hospital's chief administrator, Eleanor Hart, into his office and told her that Katie Morrison's credentials were fraudulent, that she'd endangered a patient, that she'd violated multiple safety protocols during Emma's emergency intervention the night before. He didn't mention that Katie had saved the girl's life. He framed it as recklessness. She performed a procedure without authorization, he told Hart, his voice steady and reasonable. A pericardiocentesis. That's not a nursing intervention. That's a physician's procedure. She could have perforated the cardiac wall. She could have created a hemopericardium. We could be looking at a wrongful death lawsuit. Hart's face tightened. Hospital lawyers cost money. Lawsuits cost more. "What do you recommend?" she asked. "Immediate suspension pending termination," Whitfield said. "I've already documented her credential violations. I'll have a formal report ready by end of business." Hart signed the suspension order without asking a second question. The hospital administrator's signature meant that Katie Morrison was no longer an employee of Cedar Creek Medical as of 5:27 p.m. that day. She just didn't know it yet. The paperwork was waiting in her locker the next morning. A thin manila envelope with a hospital logo and Eleanor Hart's signature. Immediate suspension pending formal termination hearing. All access badges revoked. All patient files sealed. Security would escort her from the building. Katie stood in the locker room at 6:14 a.m., still in street clothes, holding the envelope in both hands. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone. Around her, the morning shift nurses moved past with careful eyes, avoiding her gaze, they already knew. Word spread through hospital staff like oxygen through blood. By 6:51 a.m., everyone at Cedar Creek Medical knew that Katie Morrison was finished. She changed into her street clothes slowly. Methodical. Her movements never rushed, never desperate. She placed her stethoscope in her bag. Her trauma shears, the ones with Reaper 6 etched into the titanium handles, a memento from another life that she'd kept hidden in her locker for 18 years, went in last. She zipped the bag. She closed the locker door. She didn't lock it. There was nothing left to protect. Dr. Whitfield stood 10 feet away, leaning against a row of lockers with his arms crossed, watching. He was smiling. Not the smile of a man who'd won an argument. The smile of a man who'd broken something he couldn't put back together and didn't care. Hospital security stood by the locker room entrance, Eddie Walsh and another officer named Martinez, both of them looking at their shoes instead of at Katie. She walked toward the exit. Whitfield stepped into her path, not blocking her exactly, just existing in a space she had to navigate around. "You should have listened," he said quietly. "You should have quit when I gave you the chance." Katie didn't break stride. Didn't make eye contact. Just moved past him like he was furniture. His smile faltered. That was the worst part for Whitfield. She didn't argue back, didn't cry, didn't beg. She just accepted it and kept walking. She was 10 steps from the exit when the pediatric wing doors opened from the opposite direction. And that's when the real nightmare began. A 16-year-old boy walked through those doors carrying a shadow box. Navy blue velvet backing. Polished brass frame. Inside, medals arranged in ascending order, each catching the overhead lights like pieces of evidence. Katie's dress whites folded pristine beneath them. The boy's face was a mirror of Katie's, same jawline, same eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic, same terrible certainty about what had to happen next. "Mom," he said, loud enough for the entire hallway to hear. "They need to see these." Katie's feet stopped moving. For the first time since the suspension papers hit her hands, her composure cracked, not visible to anyone but the people who knew her, but cracked nonetheless. A single inhale. A pause. Then her hands moved at her sides, opening just slightly, as if to say no. Too late. The narrative had already shifted. Lieutenant Commander James Hartley was in the hallway. He'd been visiting Emma, the girl healthy now, walking on her own, eating breakfast in the cafeteria. He'd been preparing to leave when a teenager in jeans and a Navy recruiting t-shirt walked past carrying military regalia. Hartley's eyes followed the boy. Then followed the boy's gaze to Katie. Recognition hit him like shrapnel. His face went white. His hand came up to his left forearm where the tattoo still lived, the one with her name, faded after 18 years but still legible to anyone who knew what they were looking for. "Reaper 6, he whispered. Just those 2 words. A question that wasn't a question. A name that changed everything. Eddie Walsh straightened to attention. The elderly security guard, 73 years old, Marine Corps veteran from 1968, had spent the last 3 months watching this woman move through Cedar Creek Medical with the discipline and composure of someone he recognized at a cellular level. Someone who'd seen what he'd seen. Someone who'd carried what he'd carried. When the shadow box opened and the medals caught the light, Eddie's hand came up to his chest in a salute. Not casual. Not ceremonial. The kind of salute you give when you're in the presence of rank that transcends uniforms. "Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy," he announced, his voice steady as a surgical laser. A Navy captain visiting another patient in the hallway heard the announcement and turned. His eyes landed on the shadow box. He walked closer. He picked it up with the reverence of someone handling sacred objects. He began reading aloud, each medal its own sentence, each one landing like a court verdict. Bronze Star. Katie's son Marcus stood motionless beside his mother. Silver Star. A crowd was forming, nurses, doctors, orderlies, families from other wards. 2 Purple Hearts. Whitfield's face had drained of all color. He was backing away now, realizing that he'd picked a fight with something he couldn't control. And a Navy Cross citation for carrying 3 wounded SEALs through a 4-hour firefight in Tikrit, maintaining fire superiority while managing critical hemorrhage in 2 patients simultaneously. The hallway had gone dead silent. No beeping monitors could be heard from the wards. No pages overhead. Just breathing. Just the sound of institutional hierarchy collapsing like a house of cards in wind. James Hartley stepped forward. His hand went to his tattooed forearm, K. Morrison, the letters faded but eternal. His voice broke when he spoke. She took shrapnel in both legs and didn't stop moving until all three of us were in that helicopter. I was a junior SEAL then. She was a Master Chief. She could have left me behind. She didn't stop until we were all out. He looked at Katie directly now, and his eyes were shining. She's the reason I'm alive. Emma's alive because her father is alive. Because of you. Whitfield tried to move toward the exit. Hospital security, both Eddie and Martinez, suddenly found reasons to stand in his way. Not blocking him exactly. Just existing in his path the way Katie had existed in theirs. By that evening, Whitfield understood that his institutional power meant nothing when the federal government stepped in. He spent the night in his office, handshaking as he opened Katie's personnel file and began altering documents. He forged performance reviews dated weeks earlier. He created false patient complaint reports. He doctored emails. He even fabricated an incident report claiming Katie had endangered a patient during a routine for insertion. His signature on the hospital administrator's authorization line was trembling. He'd made a career out of controlling narratives. But he couldn't control this one. At 9:17 a.m. the next morning, FBI agents walked through Cedar Creek Medical's main entrance. Not looking for Whitfield. Not investigating the fraud ring Katie had been sent to expose. They were there because Whitfield's panicked forgery had generated digital timestamps that contradicted the hospital's system logs by 6 weeks. Evidence tampering. Obstruction of federal investigation. Falsification of records. The moment the FBI's forensic accountant opened Katie's real file, the one kept by NCIS, not by Cedar Creek, they saw the forgeries immediately. Dates that didn't match. Signatures that didn't authenticate. One agent looked at Whitfield standing in the hallway, his face already resigned to what was coming. "Sir, you need to come with us." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Whitfield's career ended not with violence or vindication, but with zip ties and a federal indictment. The fraud ring he'd been protecting, the one connected to his North Carolina business partner and involving 17 physicians across 5 hospitals, unraveled within 48 hours. $40 million in Medicare fraud recovered. 17 arrests. Cedar Creek Medical rebuilt under new leadership. Emma Hartley sent Katie a photo exactly 2 years later, Dr. Marcus Whitfield in a community college gymnasium, polo shirt instead of white coat, teaching CPR basics to teenagers who'd rather be anywhere else. Teaching for minimum wage because his medical license was permanently revoked. Because the truth didn't just silence the room. It ended careers. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who didn't know your real value, share this story. Hit subscribe. Tell us in the comments, would you have saved her anyway, even knowing it would cost you everything? Because Katie Morrison did. That's what true class looks like.